After more than a decade and billions of dollars invested into the development of the Air Force's next-generation air dominance fighter, well, the program remains on hold, awaiting a funding decision from the Trump administration. But after months of Air Force officials politely dodging the question to make sure they didn't step on the toes of incoming leadership, the tone of this conversation has officially changed, and the Air Force is no longer mincing its words. According to America's AirPower leadership, the nation needs to move ahead with a new generation of air superiority fighters, or risk facing a significantly steeper uphill climb to secure air dominance in the years ahead. In a future rife with newly emerging threats ranging from long-range, precision-guided hypersonic missiles to surface-to-air interceptors pulling target data from satellites high overhead, the Air Force just doesn't believe it can rely solely on an air superiority fighter that was designed before the first internet web browser, before text messaging, or even DVDs hit the market. And to be clear with you right up front, I agree. So let's talk about why the Air Force believes America needs the next generation air dominance fighter, why the uncertainty of the future has called this program into question, and what it'll take to retain America's seat up at the top of the air power food chain. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is AirPower. Famed Marine General James Mattis once said that no enemy has done more harm to the U.S. military than unpredictable funding. But Congress has yet to learn that lesson, so this week, yet another round of Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force leaders called on Congress to pass an actual budget, as the stopgap funding bills Congress keeps using to avoid a government shutdown once again are having a deeply negative impact on the cost of ongoing programs, on troop readiness, and on force-wide modernization efforts. And I've been staying on top of all of this thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all around the world and places them all into a single, easy-to-read feed, making it simpler than ever to not just stay on top of what's going on in the world, but also to peer through the veil of bias that's so common in modern news media. Right here on Ground News, I can see that only 9 outlets have covered this story so far, and you can really see an imbalance in coverage between left and right-leaning outlets, with just 3 left-leaning outlets covering this story, and no right-leaning ones following suit just yet. Now, this is something I've seen in real time over my years as a journalist. Despite how incredibly important the budget is, discussions about it tend to be, pretty dry and technical. Accounting debates rarely make for viral headlines, and in our attention-based media market, virality tends to be prized over substance. And aside from keeping me informed, Ground News also makes these real concerns I have about modern media a lot easier to spot and quantify. Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet, along with the headlines, like their political bias, factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me news stories like this one that are getting attention in one political sphere, but not in the other. It helps me make sure I'm keeping my media intake balanced. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. Last week, in our discussion about Boeing's B-1R proposal, I brought up the way competing philosophies within America's warfighting apparatus emerge first in simple discussion, and then later go on to inform proposed programs that compete with one another not just for funding, but for influence, with the capabilities selected to go into production ultimately becoming the foundations of entire generations of air power doctrine. Boeing's B-1R, as an example, was just one of several proposed options for increasing America's ability to deliver conventional ordnance to far-flung targets in greater volume, with other possibilities diverging so dramatically from the B-1R concept that really the only thing they had in common were their intended outcomes. Those outcomes, of course, being putting more warheads on foreheads. Aside from the B-1R, the Air Force considered a B-2 upgrade program, a blended wing-body arsenal plane, and even conventionally armed ICBMs. These options represented a lot more than just a single aircraft acquisition, and instead they reflected competing air warfare ideologies, like speed versus stealth, missiles versus airplanes, and so on. You can't fund every program, and as a result, choosing to push an aircraft into production or to begin a complete capability overhaul invariably represents a vote of confidence not just in that platform or even in the company doing the work, but in the vision of the future that the program is built to address, or engage, or mitigate, or at the very least, operate inside of. In a sense, defense officials are trying to develop and build multi-billion-dollar puzzle pieces meant to fit into a puzzle that hasn't been made yet, using nothing but analysis of emerging technologies and warfare trends to figure out exactly what kinds of weird edges and bulbous protrusions the piece will need to slide right into its spot 10, 20, maybe even 50 years from now when the puzzle finally comes together. And to stretch this puzzle metaphor to its breaking point, the challenge is even greater for top-tier combat aircraft, like air superiority fighters or strategic bombers, because these aircraft are much more than just a random patch of blue sky or green grass in the middle of that puzzle. These platforms and the capabilities they bring to bear become the foundation for everything from overarching warfare strategies all the way down to individual fighter tactics. They are the corner pieces from which all the rest of the puzzle must take shape. And as a result, these programs are always rife with debate over what the best options really are. And today, the Air Force's next generation air dominance fighter finds itself the subject of just such a debate. Within the Air Force and beyond, there are several competing belief systems about the nature of modern air warfare and the way today's emerging technologies will shape tomorrow's battlefield. Now, some of these belief systems are built upon a better understanding of warfare than others, but truthfully, several could result in a capability mix that could give America the competitive edge it needs to fight and win in the skies of the, let's say, 2040s and beyond. The problem, of course, comes down to funding and figuring out which of these possibilities can do the job without breaking the bank. And that brings us to the reason the Air Force's NGAD program was paused in the first place. As we've discussed several times in the past, NGAD has been in development in one form or another for more than a decade now, and encompasses far more than just a new stealth fighter, including AI-enabled drone wingmen called collaborative combat aircraft, new long-range weapon systems, and a whole lot more. But right from the start, at the heart of this program has been the need to field a new penetrating counter-air fighter that's even more capable than today's reigning king of the skies, the F-22 Raptor. Of course, in the 35 years since the first YF-22 prototype started flying, no aircraft has emerged as a clear superior. And that all but guarantees that building the Raptor's replacement will be an immensely expensive undertaking. According to recently outgoing Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, getting this new NGAD fighter through the remaining development stages will likely cost another $20 billion. And after that, each fighter produced by this program may ring in at as much as $300 million each. That means just one of these new fighters may cost as much as 3 F-35s today. And with the Air Force already on the hook to fund the continued development of the vastly over-budget LGM-35 Sentinel ICBM, as well as the continued development and production of the largely on-track but nonetheless expensive B-21 Raider, the Air Force pretty clearly just can't afford to pay for the NGAD program too. At least, not without a pretty significant budget infusion. But it's important to remember that the budget does not dictate the threat environment. And not being able to afford a new air superiority fighter is not the same as not needing one. And this much was made pretty clear at last week's Air Force Association Warfare Symposium in Denver, Colorado. During a panel discussion, Air Force Major General Joseph Kunkel discussed the NGAD program pretty bluntly, while dismissing the sentiment that air superiority no longer matters. I'll quote him now. Many of you know we put a pause on NGAD, and we put a pause on NGAD to reflect, and we did a study on it. With that study, we asked ourselves some hard questions. Is air superiority dead? What does air superiority look like in the future? Does the joint force need air superiority? And what we found, not only in the past, not only in the present, but in the future, air superiority matters. The general went on to say, we tried a whole bunch of different options, and there was no more viable option than NGAD to achieve air superiority in this highly contested environment. Now, that sentiment was later echoed by General Kenneth Wilsbach, head of Air Combat Command, on that same panel. I'll quote him now. The entire joint force counts on air superiority, so anything else you want to do in the battle space, if you don't have air superiority, it becomes much more difficult, if not impossible. Now, General Wilsbach went on to cite the recent emergence of new Chinese stealth aircraft in testing as further reason to invest in NGAD today. I'll quote him again. As we observe what China has produced, and we can presume we know what that's for air superiority, what are we going to do about it? And I don't believe that nothing is an option. Now, just like the B-1R in the early 2000s, this NGAD fighter proposal represents just one of several potential paths forward, each centered around different platforms or systems that could go on to become the corner pieces of the American AirPower puzzle in the years ahead. But the Air Force claims it's conducted an objective analysis of these alternatives and found no option better suited for the job. I'll quote General Kunkel again from a different talk he did at the Hudson Institute a few weeks back. The fight looks fundamentally different with the NGAD combat jet and without NGAD. I won't go into the details on how the fight looks different, but the fight looks much better when NGAD is in it. Of course, out here in the public, we don't have access to that classified report, so the best we can do is conduct our own analysis of alternatives, using notably less juicy unclassified information to see if we don't land on a similar conclusion. Now, one clearly competing air warfare philosophy represented in formal Air Force documentation comes in the form of the Department of the Air Force 2050 report that was released late last year. Now, this report claims forward operating bases will be too vulnerable to long-range strike from cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles, and air-to-air refueling will be dramatically hindered by new surface-to-air missiles with 1,000-mile ranges. Now, it goes on to suggest that achieving air superiority then may only be possible in short bursts, or pulses as they put it, over small areas. And as a result, the 2050 report effectively contends that fighters as we know them today will no longer be viable in 2050. And instead, America needs to turn to much longer-ranged platforms like strategic bombers, bolstered by extremely long-range munitions like cruise and hypersonic missiles to fight and win in such an environment. Now, in our dive into this report, I already went over why an over-reliance on high-end, long-range munitions like cruise missiles creates a lot of unnecessary risk and uneven pressure on America's industrial base. So today, let's focus on the idea that America could rely solely on long-range platforms like stealth bombers for the air superiority mission, because, well, it doesn't make much sense either. Back in January of 2023, the Center for Strategic and International Studies released a report entitled The First Battle of the Next War, outlining a series of 24 separate war games played out to simulate a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, their conclusions mirrored that of the 2050 report to some extent, highlighting the importance of bombers operating from outside the reach of enemy airstrikes, but nonetheless also emphasized the importance of even non-stealth and fairly short-ranged fourth-generation fighters, despite the vulnerability of their air bases, to generate enough sorties to gain a strategic advantage against China's significant numbers in theater. Put simply, operating from further away means that it takes a lot longer to get to the target zone and deploy your ordnance, and likewise, a lot longer to get back, reducing the total number of sorties that you can fly. So, if you take off from an airstrip 6 hours away from your target, it'll take 12 hours to complete your mission, and your airframe can only complete 1 sortie per day. But if instead you take off from an airstrip that's just 3 hours away, well, then it only takes 6 hours to complete the sortie, and another pilot can hop into that aircraft and fly a second sortie that same day, effectively having the same impact as doubling the number of aircraft that you have in the fight each day, simply by reducing the distance that each aircraft needs to cover. Now, this would be particularly important in the initial days of such a fight, where China would boast a substantial numerical advantage, while the US and its allies rushed to get aircraft and assets from elsewhere in the world into that theater. As a December 2024 assessment published by the Stimson Center highlights, it would be during this initial 72-hour window where Chinese landing craft would traverse the Taiwan Strait to land troops in Taiwan, meaning the ability to launch more sorties to deploy more anti-ship weapons during this initial period would have a huge impact on Taiwan's ability to defend itself. As General Kunkel put it, you've got to be forward in order to sustain the tempo that's required to bring the adversary to a sneeze. So in all long-range force, it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? You sit in Topeka, Kansas, you press a red button, the war gets fought. Nobody gets hurt. It's all done at long range. But it doesn't win because it just can't sustain the tempo of the fight. If America were to rely solely, or even primarily, on subsonic heavy payload bombers operating over thousands of miles, it would be extremely difficult to generate enough sorties to have the necessary impact in those early days of war. A new fighter, however, that offered greater range than today's F-22 and greater speeds than a bomber, especially one that could operate from relatively austere airfields for agile combat employment, would be invaluable in such a fight. Now, the next competing philosophy is a frustrating one, because it's predicated on a pop culture understanding of warfare that's been significantly amplified by the likes of people like Elon Musk. This idea that crewed fighters need not exist in today's world thanks to the advent of drones. Now, to be clear, drones really do, and will continue to, play a vital role in American air power, but ongoing efforts to field sufficiently capable artificial intelligence to pilot these combat aircraft, like the Air Force Research Lab's ongoing Skyborg program, have consistently demonstrated the need for local human operators to handle complex decision-making for these drones. And when I say drones in this context, I do not mean low-cost quadcopters like the ones you've seen employed in drone swarms. Small drones like those are, by their very design, significantly limited in range, speed, and operational altitude, and just straight up couldn't do the same sort of combat operations that are required to secure air superiority and that enable further air and surface operations. Instead, the types of drones that would be valuable in this sort of fight would be collaborative combat aircraft, or CCAs, which are really just fighter jets without a cockpit that, while cheaper than today's top-tier fighters, still ring in at tens of millions of dollars apiece. AI-enabled drones will be able to complete many combat tasks on their own, but for complex operations, they'll continue to need human pilots flying nearby for some time to come. In fact, according to some experts in the AI field, having a human in the loop may be a requirement forever. Now, this is in large part due to even the most advanced AI agents struggling to make decisions when lacking the necessary information, or just as importantly, when exposed to related but unnecessary additional information. In either case, the performance of even the most advanced and capable AI models can drop by as much as 65%, according to a recent peer-reviewed study. So we can't pass NGAD's job over to bombers entirely, nor can we pretend crewed fighters are already a thing of the past just because, well, some people think that'll be true in the future. So what about just using the aircraft we already have? America's top-tier air superiority fighter, the F-22 Raptor, is, of course, already amid a massive $11+ billion upgrade and overhaul to dramatically increase its capability. And while the F-22 is generally considered to already be superior to both China's J-20 and their forthcoming J-35 in most metrics, that advantage isn't enough to overcome overwhelming numbers. With only 150 or so combat-coded F-22s in existence, China's J-20 fleet already outnumbers the Raptor by as much as 2-1. But even more importantly, F-22 production has been halted since 2011, meaning any Raptor that gets shot down in combat could never be replaced. And with the relatively short combat radius offered by the Raptor, it would need to operate out of closer air bases where war games repeatedly show most of the fleet being destroyed on the runway before they even have a chance to take off. Now, F-35s, while much greater in number, would face a lot of the same challenges. And while they are very capable air-to-air fighters, they're not designed to prioritize the air superiority mission. Now, once aircraft like the B-21 and submarines have effectively wiped out enough of China's anti-ship weapon emplacements to allow carriers to close to within Chinese shores, F-35s are just better used for the suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses, to allow for fourth-gen aircraft to be brought to bear, leaving the air superiority mission up to more capable air-to-air champs like the F-22 or, even better, like the NGAD. But to be clear, F-35s and F-22s could fly, fight, and win in such a conflict. It would just be a lot more difficult, more costly, and would come with greater losses. Now, this would likely hold true through the close of this decade and maybe even well into the next one. But at that point, we also need to consider the risk of America falling behind in air warfare technologies that are fielded in sufficient numbers to matter. It takes a few years for a new fighter design to get off the drawing board and into production, but then it takes even longer to build enough of these new aircraft to actually matter in a fight. Russia's anemic Su-57 fleet serves as an excellent example of just how useless a new fighter can be when it's too rare or technologically immature to actually fight the way it was meant to. Felon fanboys in the comments will be sure to remind us all about how Russia says Su-57s are lobbing missiles into Ukrainian territory, and they'll leave out how rarely these allegedly low observable aircraft actually operate inside contested airspace, which, it is worth noting, is what low observable aircraft are meant to do. Now, Lockheed Martin won the Joint Strike Fighter contract in 2001, and the first operational F-35 entered service in 2015. Likewise, the Advanced Tactical Fighter contract was awarded to Lockheed in 1991, and the F-22 Raptor it produced entered service in 2005. If America kicks the air superiority can down the road by another, let's say 10 years, until 2035, well, then it's pretty likely this new fighter won't reach service until 2050, and won't exist in real numbers until a few years after that. No new F-22s will be built during this time, leaving America's air superiority job in 2050 mostly up to F-35s that themselves were largely designed in the 1990s and do not have sufficient range to operate from outside the reach of Chinese missiles. Again, I am not arguing that winning such a fight with the F-35 would be impossible. It genuinely wouldn't be, but it would be a hard fight, with F-35s squaring off against Chinese fighters that were designed around stolen F-35 schematics and matured through at least 2 iterations of jets that by then may match American and allied F-35s in numbers, if not exceeding them in theater. And while that might sound like a pretty fair fight, a fair fight is the last thing anyone fighting a war actually wants. In fact, it's the last thing any of us should want, because nations are much more likely to go to war if they're facing pretty even odds than they are if they know they've got an uphill battle ahead of them. Funding and fielding the NGAD fighter then isn't just about making a war with China easier to win, though from a practical standpoint that may indeed be what it looks like. Instead, I see it as one of the most significant ways we can prevent that fight from happening in the first place. China's espionage apparatus has left the F-22 and F-35 programs with, well, little in the way of secrets. And while both of these platforms are adding new capabilities by the day, they nonetheless represent known quantities to American adversaries. Now, known quantities can be mitigated through effective military planning, and incremental improvements can only change so much about that. Again, none of this is to say that these aircraft are obsolete or ineffective, though I know some comments will claim that. But the goal is never to match adversary capabilities. It's always got to be to exceed them. Deterring conflict means presenting such formidable force projection capabilities that adversaries recognize that actually going to war just is not worth the price of admission. China continues to close the technological gap in places like turbofan propulsion, long-range sensors, air-to-air missiles, networked targeting, and more. And we can only make jokes about things being made in China for so long before the joke is on us. But America has the opportunity right now to take another big leap out ahead, thanks to a new generation of propulsion systems, more resilient radar-absorbent materials, stealthier designs, more powerful avionics, and a whole lot more. Technologies that are already in development and in many places are already fairly mature, but could end up shelved or placed on the back burner for years without NGAD to justify them. Now, the Navy is, of course, pursuing its own new stealth fighter program, but the jet they can produce without the Air Force moving ahead with NGAD will undoubtedly be less capable than the one they produce in parallel to it. Now, America can choose to invest in NGAD, and in doing so, invest in an advantage that, at its best, could help deter the next big fight, and at its worst, would help to win it. Or the U.S. Air Force can step back from its position atop the AirPower heap and leave it up to the U.S. Navy, or maybe allies in Europe, to take its place. America's Air Force may have dominated the skies for the past 80 years or more, but rather than owning the air domain, we should really think of it as a rental. The U.S. Air Force has no preordained right to air supremacy, has no God-given power over its adversaries, and isn't so dominant today that it can afford to rest on its laurels. American warfighting doctrine splits conflict into 6 distinct phases, from shaping perceptions before warfare breaks out, to seizing the initiative, to dominating, to stabilizing, and finally enabling civil authorities. And while each of these phases are so complex and nuanced that we could write a whole book about each, they all have one thing in common. Every single step is predicated on America's ability to secure the airspace above the fight. So, with that in mind, the Air Force and America in general now faces a decision. Will it invest in maintaining the air combat advantage it needs to deter its adversaries? Or will it take a big step back and relegate the days of American air dominance to the history books? I mean, from where I stand, the right answer seems pretty obvious. And with that ends yet another edition of AirPower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.